Hello, everyone. This is part 1 of week 3 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist, and we continue to talk about the Protagoras. At the beginning of the dialogue, Plato presents Socrates and Protagoras in conversation about virtue, the teachability of virtue, the unity of the virtues, using a method that Socrates prefers, the method of question and answer. Protagoras is not entirely comfortable with that method. He likes to give long speeches, and he also likes to do something that the Sophists are famous for, namely to interpret poetry. So this is what he wants to do now, and Socrates goes along with it. Protagoras wants to talk about a poem by Simonides, a famous ancient poet, and he wants to charge Simonides with a contradiction. Namely, according to Protagoras, Simonides says that it is hard for human beings to become good. And he also says that it is false to say that it is hard for human beings to be good. Now, a few notes about these two claims. First, the first of them is relativized to human beings. So it is hard for human beings to become good. That is not an explicit component of the second claim, but we can sort of read it into it because that is how the discussion in the dialogue treats both of the claims. Then we are talking about what is hard for human beings. So Protagoras thinks that the following two claims mean the same. It is hard to become good and it's hard to be good. Now, if these two claims mean the same, then it would be inconsistent for Simonides to say on the one hand that it is hard to become good, and to also dispute on the other hand that it is hard to be good. But Socrates takes issue with the idea that to become good and to be good kind of amount to the same thing. And that leads us to a major metaphysical distinction in Plato, namely the distinction between becoming and being. So Socrates argues that Simonides is entirely consistent in saying that it is hard for human beings to become good. So he fully embraces that, and we can imagine that Plato also fully embraces that. Virtue is hard. It is really difficult to become a good person. But it's also compatible with that to say that it is false to claim that it is hard to be good. And why is that compatible? Well, because being good just isn't in the cards for human beings to begin with. So it isn't hard or easy or anything for us. And in making this proposal, Socrates can seem to, really not do justice to Simonides. He is this ancient poet, and Socrates seems to ascribe to him one of the most complicated metaphysical distinctions in Plato's philosophy. It has been argued, however, by philologists that it is not an entirely implausible interpretation of Simonides. But we will set that aside. We will set aside of whether that is, as interpretation of a poem plausible, and rather we'll just think about it as a metaphysical proposal. Plato's later dialogues have a lot to say about the distinction between becoming and being. For example, and most famously, the forms are or are in the domain or the world of being, whereas everything perceptible, or as, people who work on Plato will put this, perceptible particulars, meaning particular things like trees or people or tables or houses or tigers, which are sense perceptible, those things, entities, are in the domain of becoming. And another somewhat more technical formulation that comes up in later dialogues is that they are becomings, as it were, that is a technical noun, where the idea is that, say, a tiger at no point just is stably and firmly and in a fixed kind of way what it is. Rather, it's always, growing or eating, or cells are decaying, new cells are growing, and so on and so forth. And something like that is going to be true for Plato of everything in the sense perceptible world, that it is in whatever dimensions, and that is subject to scholarly dispute, in change. Now, I want to invite you to just sort of think about the following question. It has been argued that this kind of distinction is a little bit out of place in an early dialogue. Like, assuming the Protagoras is an early dialogue, why is Plato introducing this heavy-duty metaphysical distinction in order to make the point that human beings, we can become virtuous, and that's very hard. We cannot be virtuous simply because we are not the kind of entity that, say, a form is. Now, for example, Dorothea Friede argued in a paper published in 1986 that probably Plato actually revised the Protagoras later on in his career, because that distinction simply seems so much a distinction from his later metaphysics. Another way you could look at it is just to wonder whether maybe thinking about human virtue, which is the key topic of the Protagoras, actually fuels Plato's thought in metaphysics, whether the idea that human beings cannot just be virtuous, but always have to sort of work on it, always find themselves in a process of becoming virtuous without ever kind of stably really being virtuous, whether that could actually be a motivation for the way in which Plato develops his metaphysics. Now, there's also another famous paper that is by Michael Friede, published in 1988, just on how to think of that notion of becoming. And that is what I want to explain at the end of this recording. You might think there's something really noteworthy and puzzling about a notion of becoming, where whatever becomes a certain way never ends up being that way. So, for example, you might think that if someone becomes a baker, then at some point they are a baker. If someone becomes an architect, at some point they are an architect. But that just doesn't seem to be the case with how a human being can become good or virtuous. Rather, as much as a human being can put effort into becoming a good person, that is just going to be an ongoing effort. So we have a way of using the word becoming, where to become X does not lead into being X. And that is what Michael Friede's paper is about. I want to invite you to think about that, just with a view to this contrast between virtue on the one hand and kinds of expertise on the other hand. If it does seem plausible that becoming a baker leads to being a baker, but not plausible that becoming good or virtuous leads to simply being good or virtuous, that might be another way to compare virtue on the one hand and expertise on the other.